Hello, Augies Worldwide. I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG, and today we're going to explore shortwave listening, or SWL. This is something that hams don't often engage in, but a lot of the public does. And I have a friend named Valerie who has just purchased a shortwave radio and wants to know how to use it. So I thought, well, my goodness, why don't I do an introduction to shortwave radio? This might also be useful to you if you're studying to get your technician license and you'd like to tune around on the bands outside the ham bands just a little bit and see what's available out there. So let's dive in to shortwave listening. I put a few charts together to remind myself of some things to say, so let's dive in. First of all, what is shortwave listening, or SWL? And yes, some people pronounce it SWL, but we'll just call it SWL or shortwave listening. Shortwave listening is listening to a radio for news, information, and entertainment, and here's the key part, from all over the world, okay? Now, although the term includes shortwave in the title, the bands used are long wave, medium wave, and shortwave. Medium wave is your normal AM broadcast band. Long wave is like an AM broadcast band in Europe. It's not used that much in the Western Hemisphere. So long wave, medium wave, short wave. These names go back to the earliest days of radio when they thought this covered all of radio. Long wave, medium wave, short wave, okay? Well, then when they started to go beyond that in World War II, that era, we ended up with, well, what do you call something that's above high frequencies, which is shortwave? You call them very high frequencies, and they went on to ultra high frequencies, super high frequencies, and so on until they came up with other names. But anyway, these are the bands. They go back to the earliest days of radio. Now, often shortwave listener radios these days also include an FM receiver. FM in much of the world has a broader band, a bigger band, than in the U.S. The U.S. band starts at 88.1. That's 88.1 megahertz, by the way, and goes up to about 107. Long wave is used much more in Europe. The interesting little story here, the Beatles couldn't get the latest music on BBC because it was a very conservative organization and didn't play the cool stuff. So they would listen on long wave to Europe, where people were less stuffy about the kind of music they listened to. And they got much of their early inspiration from listening to long wave from Europe. What can you hear on a shortwave radio? Well, what most people are thinking of when they think of shortwave radio is shortwave broadcasting. These are programs sponsored by governments around the world, such as the BBC from the UK, the Voice of America, Armed Forces Radio, which is a U.S. thing, which the U.S. broadcasts to its troops around the world. Radio Moscow, Radio North Korea, Radio Japan, Radio everything. There's lots and lots there. There's many more. There are fewer since the Cold War has ended, because one of the big purposes of the big shortwave stations during the Cold War was to convince people on the other side that they were wrong and people on our side that they were right. And of course, on the other side, they tried to, like Radio Moscow, they tried to convince us we were wrong, they were right, and so on. Now, in addition to that, you will also hear privately sponsored shortwave stations, such as religious stations. People want to take their ministry to whatever means they can to reach as many people as possible. Now, there's some interesting pirate radio stations. These are radio stations that are unauthorized by any government. Sometimes they're done from ships just offshore and so on. And needless to say, since these guys are not government or not government sanctioned, they can say some amazing things, and they often won't be on the air for very long. They keep popping up, though. You'll hear other stations like time stations. If you can imagine listening to WWV all day, you'll just hear it constantly tell you the time. And if you're on a ship at sea and your GPS isn't working or something like that, you can listen to WWV and get the current time. The number of users for this have really gone down. In fact, it almost got cut from the budget this year, but it's still going strong. A lot of people use it. Utility stations are non-broadcast stations. For example, aircraft over the oceans carry HF radio. HF is the same as shortwave. And that way, because of the long distances involved, the aircraft can talk to their companies, they can talk to the FAA or to the France or wherever they want to talk to. There are point-to-point services, especially in the developing world where there is no infrastructure. I remember when I was in the Philippines on my Mormon mission that there was a company called RCPI, Radio Communications of the Philippine Islands, and they had a Morse code set up, and every town and village had its little RCPI office, and you could send telegrams anywhere else in the Philippines, or for that matter in the world, and they would use HF radio to do that. Ship to shore used to be strongly over HF and also on long wave, but nowadays is mostly satellite. Spy stations show up. You'll hear these referred to sometimes as number stations, and where a voice will just be endlessly reading off numbers or maybe numbers and letters. Often these are government-sponsored stations sending coded instructions to their spies, because unlike the internet or the phone system, you can't trace where your broadcast is going to, so people can listen to this without getting hooked up in such a way that they can be found. Another thing on shortwave radio that you can listen to are radio hams. Amateur radio has several different bands in the shortwave region, and you can listen into these. And of course, maybe you'll find it so interesting that you get your ham license so that you can join in with the rag chewing or the contests or the DXing or the public service or many of the other things that ham radio does. Now, I will note that many of these things, like ship to shore, has moved to satellite. A lot of the information dissemination has moved to the internet, although, of course, in the internet it gets lost in all the noise. But a lot of things do this. There are a lot of advantages to shortwave radio. I'll touch on some of them later. Now, shortwave radio goes back a very long ways. This is Marconi right here, a picture from Wikipedia. And he would transmit from England and then see how far away he could get to hear this. He would go down to the Cape Verde Islands, or I think one time he took his yacht to Beirut, and just to see how far radio would go. Those were the very early days of radio, and people were very impressed by how far radio could go. Of course, you know, in about 1903, I think it was, he was able to transmit from the United Kingdom in Wales all the way to Canada in North America, and then from there it could go via telegraph, proving the tremendous reach of shortwave radio. Of course, the big climax was in 1912 when the Marconi station aboard the Titanic put out its SOS call, and many other ships were able to hear it because they all used Marconi systems. And very, very interesting history of radio, he is shown there with a spark station and also with a little paper tape. I'm not sure if it's a transmitter or a receiver, but it would be using the Morse code. By the way, I'll point out it was not using the American Railroad code, which was the original Morse code, but using a version of the Morse code that had been modified by German experience, which is now called the International Morse Alphabet number 1, and is what hams use on the air. Now, how does this information get across the ocean without using any infrastructure, without having to have a cable under the oceans or a telephone line or something like that? Well, the answer is certain radio waves, when sent, and I show it here in France, right down over here, when they go up in the air, they meet something called the ionosphere, which is just a layer of the atmosphere that's been bombarded by radiation from the sun, and it becomes a little bit reflective to radio waves, and then comes back down who knows where. Actually, scientists do know where. They've got a lot of information on this, but comes down to where you are, and you can hear it. Now, I just want to introduce you, while we're talking about the ionosphere, to an interesting little phenomenon, because you'll hear this term a lot. When the rays go out from an antenna, they hit the ionosphere, which is up about here. Some pass through and go out so that Martians and Jovians can listen to our TV signals. And then the rest is reflected back down to Earth. There's a region in between that explains why sometimes you can't hear radios that are nearby. Because if they go up at this angle, they go out into space, and then when they start to get reflected back, they're 1,000 miles away. This is called the skip zone. And it just means that sometimes you won't be able to hear radio stations that are close. So the various radio broadcasters tend to place their transmitters around the world. If you're listening to London, the signal may not be coming from London. It could be coming from the Caribbean, in order that they can get the right signal to you. Now, I want to introduce you to a shortwave radio. I picked up this picture of a generic shortwave radio from Wikipedia. There are 3 things that are important on here that enable you to find stations. And toward the end, I'll give you some internet addresses that you can go to get actual station information about what's broadcasting when, what language it's in, where the transmitter is, and so on, so that you can determine what you can listen to. The first thing is called the mode. In this here, it's AM for amplitude modulation. This is the same mode as listening to an ordinary AM broadcast receiver, except it's on shortwave. Okay, this is the frequency expressed in kilohertz, 3980. And I'll talk a little bit about frequencies in the next chart. And then down here is the band. And oddly enough, the band is in meters and the frequency is in kilohertz or megahertz. And does that confuse people? Of course it does. We'll talk a little bit about that. The frequency of a station, a transmitter, think of it as an address on the airwaves where you can find a particular station on the radio dial. It tells you what your radio is tuned to right now. Each station has a different frequency, although, yes, there are more stations than there are frequencies, and so you sometimes get some interference between them and so on. Sometimes that interference is deliberate. If somebody is jamming something, like the Russians are jamming Radio Free Europe or something like that. But it's just an address. It's a number that you're going to punch into your radio so you can tell your radio where to go to find a station. It is expressed in kilohertz or megahertz. Now note the weird capitalization conventions. That's a small k, a big H, a small z. And in megahertz, it's a big M, big H, small z. Now, this 3850 kilohertz is the same as 3.850 megahertz. Much of shortwave is done in kilohertz. So you'll see this. When you get up above 10 megahertz, it becomes like 13850, and that becomes a mouthful. So they might give you 3.850, but mostly you'll see it in kilohertz. The frequency is always shown on the radio dial. In this example, 3980. Okay, it's always shown on the radio dial. Often radios have memories where you can store your favorite frequencies and give them names. For example, BBC or Radio France or Radio Japan, which is NHK, Nippon Hoso Kyokai, I think. I undoubtedly butchered that, which is why it's just called NHK, but that's Radio Japan. There are all kinds of stations out there. Okay, frequency is the address. Now, a band, if frequency is the address, then the band is the street the address is on. It's measured in meters. It's left over from the old days when people used wavelengths in meters instead of frequencies in hertz. So you get the two combined. Now, shortwave broadcasters tend to clump into bands, and you'll have your best luck finding unknown shortwave broadcasters by going through these bands. Ham operators have their own bands too, which are separate mostly from the shortwave broadcasters. Let's look at the shortwave bands. This is from Wikipedia. The two that are in yellow are the most popular, where you will find most of your shortwave stations. Under certain circumstances, you will find lots of stations in other bands. If you happen to live down near the Mexican border, or you are in South America, you'll find shortwave broadcasters on what we call the tropical bands. These bands are called that because it's stations in the tropics that tend to use them. Often these broadcasters are not trying to broadcast to some other country, but it's used domestically. Now, the problem with AM, as you know, is during the daytime you can only hear it in the city where the transmitter is. It doesn't go beyond that. But if you go up like the 120 meter band, the 90 meter band, and so on, that band can cover a whole country, like Ecuador or something like that. So people need shortwave radios to listen to it, but they can listen to it in their own language. One of the things about listening to this, if you get like, around sunset or maybe early in the morning, and you listen through these bands, you can hear some of these broadcasts. Now, what's interesting about it is they broadcast to the musical taste of their local citizenry, which can be very different from the music that you hear in the United States. So if you want to hear cool Latin music, this is where you go. The 49 meter band, from which contains addresses from 5900 to 6200 kilohertz, is a very popular band. And the 31 meter band, which goes from 9400 to 9900 kilohertz, is also heavily used. The other bands up there are very useful when the ionosphere is good. The sun works in an 11-year cycle, and right now it's at the bottom of its cycle. And the cycle is determined by the number of sunspots, oddly enough. Sunspots put out a lot of ultraviolet radiation, which excites the ionosphere so that you can hear around the world. Whereas when the sun is at a low ebb, you don't have so much ionosphere here and you have to use lower frequencies. Okay? So, these are different bands. As the sun gets more excited in the next 4 or 5 years, you'll hear some of the shortwave broadcasters up here. Now, I will tell you right now that most of your luck listening to these will be at night. Sometimes you can hear things early in the morning, like from Australia, if the path between us and the transmitter is in the dark. But these are where you can start. I'm going to show you some websites in a minute that will give you some specific frequencies that you can tune to. Now, there are something called modes, and that's not a disease. It's just the name of the way the information is transmitted. You're familiar with amplitude modulation because your AM radio uses AM, amplitude modulation. Almost all long wave, medium wave, and shortwave broadcasting is AM. So you set your radio for AM. Now, of course, as I will mention a little bit later on, most shortwave radios have the FM band, your FM broadcast band, built in too, so you can listen to the local stuff during the day. Now, you'll see this phrase, single sideband, or SSB, sometimes lower sideband or upper sideband. Sometimes the switch that gets you there is marked BFO. BFO stands for Beat Frequency Oscillator. It's a very, very old term, but it is still used. You can also use this mode to listen for Morse code if you want to. I'll give you a little tip. Sometimes on the AM signals, if you're having trouble hearing them or there's interference, you can try single sideband to listen to it. Sometimes it comes through better. Sometimes. There's something called DRM for Digital Radio Mondiale. It's used by very, very few shortwave broadcasters. In spite of the hype, there are very few shortwave broadcasters who use it. It may or may not be available on your radio. If it is, and you can get a DRM station, it provides high-quality audio. Note, this does not stand for Digital Rights Management. It's Digital Radio Mondiale, or however that is pronounced. It's not an English word. There are also digital and utility modes, which include things like you can get weather maps over HF if you use your computer to decode them, radio teletype, Pactor, Cytor, and so on. You can explore these later after you get used to your radio. They're called utility modes, and they're not in the shortwave broadcast bands usually. Now, we got to talk about the time. Okay? In radio ignores national boundaries. It also ignores time zone boundaries. So in shortwave radio, the entire world is on a single time zone. And that happens to be the time in Greenwich, England, just outside London, because that's where it started. It's a type of time known as Universal Coordinated Time, but note that the acronym is UTC, not UCT, UTC. There are reasons for that, don't worry about them. It's often called Zulu time. The military uses that. The FAA uses that. It's often stated as being synonymous with Greenwich Mean Time. The Brits use Greenwich Mean Time. Actually, GMT and UTC are very, very slightly different from each other by tiny, tiny fractions of a second. So for practical purposes, for shortwave listening, it's the same time. Now, UTC is expressed in 24-hour time. For example, 3 p.m. is 1500 in military time, or GMT, not GMT. 3 p.m. local's 1500 local, but UTC, I want you to notice UTC does not observe daylight savings time. So UTC is year-round time, sort of like Arizona. You go down to Arizona, and in the southern and middle parts, they do not observe daylight savings time. They do up north in the Indian country. You may want to set up a chart so you can look up the UTC from your local time. You'll need two charts, one for your local daylight savings time and one for standard time. Now, beware that the UTC date may be 1 day different from the local day. For example, here in Colorado, 6 p.m. on Monday Mountain Standard Time is 0100 or 1 a.m. Tuesday UTC. Okay, so when UTC rolls around to 2300, as soon as it rolls past 0, you're now into the next day. If you'd like to know what the UTC time is right now, go to time.is/UTC. Let me show you what that looks like this. Okay, so here it was January 18th when I took this chart, and it was 22:53 and 44 seconds coordinated universal time, or universal coordinated time. You can hear it all different ways. Coordinated universal time, I think it's a little more common, okay? So there's a time.is. It will give you the time in any time zone. Now, this may come as a surprise to many Americans, but there are large parts of the world that do not have the top of the hour aligned with us. For example, India is 30 minutes off from the top of the clock. Other places in Asia are like 15 minutes off or 45 minutes off. This is why we need a universal time and why we use UTC. Here are some websites that'll really help you get started. www.swling or swelling.com gives you a nice intro to shortwave listening. It also contains a good list of shortwave radios, and there's some reviews in there. Now, note, it is possible to pick up on Amazon really cheap little shortwave radios, $100, $50, $25, and they're worth what you pay for them. You want a radio so that when you punch in a frequency, it goes right to it. And you don't have to piddle with the dial or something to get that in there. Now, if you are a ham and you have an HF radio, note that your ham radio can often be used as a shortwave listener receiver. Look for a button on your radio or a band slot that's got GEN, and that's how you get to what's called a general coverage receiver. Okay, and I did a video on that fairly recently. Another website that's extremely useful, very, very useful, almost mandatory, is www.shortwaveschedule.com. The capitalization is not important. Web addresses are, the part before the .com is case insensitive. This lists all shortwave broadcasters worldwide, all of it, of course, in UTC. And the frequencies are usually in kilohertz. Okay, so you can just punch them right into your radio. Now, most of these you won't be able to hear because the programming is being beamed to some other part of the world. And please note, every language on Earth is represented by some shortwave station somewhere. So, for example, if you know German, you were raised in Germany but came to the United States, you can tune in German language broadcasts and just to, listen to home kind of thing. By the way, Voice of Germany is called Deutsche Welle, which is, I guess, German voice. Another article I'd like to point you to is on Wikipedia. Look up shortwave radio. There's a nice overview in there with more detail that you'll find helpful. Also, if you'd like to learn more about ham radio, you can go to www.arrl.org. That's the American Radio Relay League.org, and learn more about ham radio that way. Now, I want to show you just a little bit about these websites. I mentioned SWLing.com. That's this one right here. And I want to read this right here. This is from Thomas Witherspoon, as quoted in the Toronto Star. Shortwave radio has little regard for distance and no regard for political borders, nor for who and how many join you to listen. This apparent information dinosaur travels at the speed of light, streams information wirelessly on affordable handheld devices. It's virtually immune to censorship and leaves no tracks. Sensorial attempts to jam it are largely unsuccessful and can usually be bypassed. Radio is, moreover, faster than the internet. Radio is straightforward and effective, and in the developing world, still absolutely vital. It often functions as a form of life support for rural and impoverished communities. For example, offering life-saving information when disaster strikes, like earthquakes or tsunamis. So, I mean, this is one reason people listen. I remember one time there was a lot of stuff on the news about a problem the U.S. was having with Japan. And I listened to the news, and okay. Well, I tuned in to Radio Japan, NHK, and got quite a different point of view. And I went, oh, now that's interesting. Also, prior to the first Gulf War, I would listen to BBC, which I considered to be the lone voice of truth in a worldwide swamp of disinformation. It was talking about the buildup to the Gulf War, whereas the American media was kind of ignoring it. And then when the Gulf War hit, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, I'd been listening to this. I was expecting it. It was clear it was going to happen, but seemed to come as a surprise to many Americans. That's because I was listening to BBC. So here is the shortwaveschedule.com. I just asked it, you can go live stations, show me. These are all the stations that were live at the time I pushed this. These are all long-wave stations down here. But notice all the many languages that are available. Or if you're listening and you've got a frequency, you can put in the frequency here so that you can see what's on that frequency right now and identify the station that you're listening to. You can also look for specific stations to see, for example, if you want to listen to Radio Havana, Cuba, which is always good for a laugh, or even more, Radio North Korea. They've got some of the wildest stuff on there you ever heard. It's just absolutely amazing. They talk about the capitalist running dogs and stuff like that. It's just a hoot. Okay, so in summary, the shortwave listener can hear amazing things on the air. Often your best listening is at night, by the way. So if you listen to our U.S. media, whether it be CNN or Fox or NBC or ABC, whatever, and you're not satisfied with only hearing about what happens in the USA, you can listen to broadcasts from other countries. Now, I will point out that the BBC does not broadcast much shortwave to the USA, but you can get it on Sirius XM, it's channel 120. And on January 6th, that's how I heard about all the hoofera. I was in my car and just punched in the BBC and got some very straight information about what was going on. Good shortwave listening radios are in the $300 price class. Of course, you can use your ham radio, HF radio for this too, but you may find that the $300 price class gives you a nice radio where you can punch in the frequency directly and so on. They'll often have built-in whip antennas that often work very well, or you can attach that to a piece of wire that you just throw outside for an antenna. Don't go to Amazon and get the $20 radio. They're very difficult to work with. What you hear is sort of by guess and by golly. You can't go to a specific frequency. They aren't built very well. They're not sensitive, and so on. You'll quickly grow tired of it, and it'll be $20 wasted, and then you'll want to go look at a good radio. But the point of it all is to have some fun. A lot of the foreign broadcasters want to hear from their listeners, and they will often give an address you can write to. You can give them a report on what you heard from them, and they will send you a QSL card, which just shows, Radio Sweden, such and such a time. Yes, that's in fact what we were transmitting. Sometimes they'll send you little stickers or a little flyer with frequencies and so on. Radio Japan used to send out reports that you could fill out and send back, and so on. It's just lots of fun on shortwave listening. Well, there we go. We've had a nice look at shortwave listening. That video was a bit long, but kind of covers the subject. I wanted to get enough in one video that if you've never done this before, you've got some idea where to start. You've got a website on how to. You've got a website where you can find the frequencies. And that SWLing.com website also lists various different kinds of radios that you can get. And, if you just turn on a shortwave radio and tune it randomly, you'll probably find nothing. But if you go to the specific bands that I laid out in here, you can usually pick up some interesting stuff. So give it a try. Take a look at it. If somebody gave you a shortwave radio for Christmas or whatever, give it a try. You may find yourself upgrading your radio. But there you go. So this is a little different from ham radio. You can listen to ham radio on your shortwave radio. And sometimes it's just people chewing the fat. Other times it's people who are doing emergency communication support, or maybe helping run a road race or something like that. All kinds of things are on ham radio. And you can also get a feel with time for when signals from certain parts of the world start to come in to where you can hear them. And sometimes you're just interested in the information. You want to know what these people have to say. So, go give it a try. If you'd like to help support this channel, please go to dcasler.com/support, where you can find a variety of ways to look at it. Also, you can go to ke0og.net, note the .net, /training to find out information about ham radio, or you can go to arrl.org and find information out about ham radio. And also, I would enjoy it if you would subscribe and click like. And until we next meet, now this is a term from ham radio that means best wishes. It dates all the way back to the American railroad telegraphers, 73, which means best wishes. So 73, and we'll see you later.